Ding dong, mother scratches. Welcome to Flipped History Lesson Plan number 2. We're talking about the age of absolutism today. We did cover this in class, and perhaps we went a little bit too fast, or you're still confused and you need some refresher. So this is basically the lecture from Wednesday/Thursday for you rookies. So you want to make sure, of course, that you have your table of contents in your notebook and age of absolutism, and we're going with 8/22/18 for the date there. So let's go back and take a look at the term absolutism, and that is a new vocabulary term we want to put in our notes. So we want to define that term first, just kind of identify what exactly it means. So first of all, when we talk about absolutism, we're primarily talking about the continent of Europe during the 1500s to 1700s, loosely in that time frame, give or take a few years. And if we have to define what absolutism is, we're going to go with the big boy definition at the bottom of your screen there. So first of all, it's just a government system. For instance, we have a republic here in the United States. It's a form of democracy. North Korea has a dictatorship. Absolutism is kind of a short term for absolute monarchy. So we're talking about people who wear these on their heads, the big daddy crown, and that would be kings, queens, absolute monarchs. That's the word there. And if you're not sure what a monarch is, I just kind of defined it for you. It's a king or a queen, and we'll talk a little bit later in the lecture how they get their power. But you want to know the word monarch if you don't already. Just think of the big daddy crown. All right. So that's what absolutism is. So let's take a look at Europe and how Europe was set up top to bottom during this age of absolutism. In other words, like who is at the very top of society and then who was next in line all the way down to the bottom. If you remember middle school, you guys learned about Hinduism. You probably learned about the caste system, where you had Indian society structured very specifically who was at the very top, and that was the priest all the way down to the workers. Well, Europe's kind of structured like that too during this time of absolutism. So at the very top of society, we have something called the Roman Catholic Church. And it is the church centered in Rome. At that time, the Catholic Church was considered to be the only church. It was universal. And the people who run the church are called the clergy. These are your priests and your bishops and the Pope, of course. Now, this is where we kind of get into some conflict, and we're going to talk really about this in this enlightenment, this whole enlightenment idea that comes along during this time. It's going to kind of have a conflict with the church. So at this time, as I said, the church was the only way. So you were expected to accept the church's teachings, and whatever the church said was to be the truth. Anyone who disagreed with the church or maybe had another belief system, these people were called heretics. And that is a term you definitely want to star because this is going to be big in the Enlightenment. And a great example of a heretic was Galileo, which Galileo will be in your SQTR this week, so you'll learn a little bit more about him. But over here on the left, oh, the lights just went off alone. I'm back. Over on the left, you have some examples of clergy members. Okay, so really ruling, this is where the structure gets kind of confused. The kings and the queens and the monarchs, the big daddies, they were really ruling alongside the church, but because they were God's representatives, we put God above the kings. So the church represents God, and then the kings are slightly below. Now, this is another important term. It's a big term that you are going to need to know, and that is called divine right. So if I'm a king, there's two ways that I gain my authority to rule over citizens. Number one, I am born into that position. This is something called a inherited rule. So if my father was the king and I'm his firstborn son, when he dies, I gain the throne. Okay, so the rule is inherited, kind of like a dynasty if you've learned that term in middle school. And the other way is divine right. Divine right simply says that God directly gives me the authority to rule over the citizens. So I am God's representative here on earth ruling the people. If you disobey me, in turn, you're disobeying God. And that is a big time sin. All right? So that's how an absolute monarch rules. Just below the absolute monarchs, we have a group called the nobility. And we hear this word a lot, nobles. Really, what nobility means is that you own land. You have a large estate, maybe a large farm. Just being a noble and just owning land gives you wealth. Because back then, everybody was basically a farmer. That's how you made your money, by growing crops. And if you own land, land can be turned into crops. There was no real political power because all the power was in the hands of the absolute monarchy, but you still were wealthy and you led a life of leisure. Over here on the left, you can see what the nobles look like, which we'll get into them more when we talk about the French Revolution, because they have a large role to play in the French Revolution. Okay, and at the bottom of society, we've got a group called the peasants, and artisans were starting to emerge as a group. Those were skilled craftsmen like a blacksmith, a carpenter, somebody who has a skill and could create things with their hands. The peasants were the majority of society, and they were the poorest, and most of them were extremely illiterate, and they did hard work, they got little profit, and they make up the majority of society. No political power at all. So we've got one man who has all the power, most of the people, no power. That's important to understand. A good example of an absolute monarch at this time was Louis XIV, also known as the Sun King, and he ruled over France. Let me get this straight. It's going to be his grandson, maybe his great grandson, Louis XVI, that's going to be the king during the French Revolution that we will role play. So one of you young men will be Louis XVI. Louis XIV was called the Sun King because just like the planets revolving around the sun, Louis XIV believed that the entire nation of France revolved around him. And his famous saying was "L'État c'est moi." L'État c'est moi simply means I am the state. And what does that mean? It means I am France, son. I am the nation. I am everything. You are nothing because only I matter, the ruler. Right? And that's important to understand. We're going to skip over the maps to explain them in class, but the geography just kind of looks at absolute monarchies during the 20th century. You can see that they're in purple and like a lavender. And at the beginning of the 20th century, there are quite a few absolute monarchies still kicking around. If you look today, that's changed quite a bit. So in red, which there's really very few. I don't know if you know this nation, that's Saudi Arabia in the Middle East. And there's one tiny one down here, Swaziland in Africa. Other than that, most monarchies today are what we call constitutional, which means there is a monarch, such as you saw the Queen of England, but she no longer has absolute power. She basically has to follow a constitution, and that checks her power. The citizens have rights, and they can vote, and they can pass laws, and she's more or less a figurehead now. Okay, so how did these kings deal with citizens who did not want to play along with the divine right and the whole church thing? Well, they used torture, and torture was used primarily for three reasons during the Middle Ages. The first would be to force confessions. That would be maybe in times of war. But the big one, really, I think, is the second one, and that was to discourage dissent. And this is a big boy word. Dissent means you just don't believe what you're being told. Like you're questioning. Like, well, wait a minute, you're telling me that the earth is flat? Well, I know for a fact that the earth's not flat. I've been out on a ship out on seas, and I can go on and on into the horizon. I don't fall off the earth. That's crazy. Crazy talk. So dissent would be anyone who's questioning. Like in class, if your student is questioning a teacher, that's dissent. They're going against the rule, the authority. And the other reason that torture was used was to persuade the non-believers to accept Christianity. And that would be primarily Jews, Muslims, and maybe some small Protestant sects that were starting to emerge. You had something called the Spanish Inquisition at this time, and that was a court that tried non-believers in Spain, many of them Muslims. Okay. The next part of this lecture gets a little bit graphic. There were different ways that these church members, the Catholic Church, would torture people. One would be the rack. You can see here how this man's arms and legs have been tied to this device. And what they do is they roll this kind of clockwise, and inch by inch, this man's limbs are torn. The bones would pop out of socket. Eventually, they would be ripped until he would confess or die. Very brutal, you can imagine. The thumb screw, that's kind of self-explanatory. Iron little spikes that crush the thumbnail and then the bone. Down. Water torture, which is going to be our first debate. The United States of America used water torture after the attacks on 9/11 against suspected terrorists. And water is forced down the victim's throat, sensation of drowning until they confess. Heretic's fork, which looks pretty gruesome, but that would require the victim to be in this position. Eventually, he's going to get tired and start to nod off, and that's when that fork would pierce the underjaw, and of course, this would force this into the collarbone area, that tender skin right above the collarbone. The breast stripper, again, self-explanatory. This was really used for a lot of accused witches, adulteresses, anyone who went a blasphemer is someone who goes against the word of the church. Pope's pear. This was also used for people who spoke out against the church. It would be forced down the victim's throat. It would be turned clockwise, and then these razor sharp points would lacerate the inside of the victim's mouth, making the victim's mouth a bloody mess. This was probably the worst form of torture. It was called hanging, drawing, and quartering. This was for rebels who went against the state. They would hang the victim until near suffocation and then drop them. They would draw, which means they would take a razor sharp knife and they would cut an incision from the sternum right down to the belly button, intestines. That's what this looks like. The sausage links would pop out. They'd still be alive, mind you. And then finally, they would tie the victim to 4 horses, the limbs being tied to 4 horses. Executioner would crack whips, and those 4 horses would take off, and all 4 limbs would be ripped from the body. And the worst form of torture, as we learned today in class, country western music. That's a little chuckle, chuckle, ha ha. Exit ticket, this should be in your notebooks. Gosh damn lights keep going off in here. How did monarchs justify their absolute authority over nobles and peasants? What did they use to justify their rule? Secondly, why do you suppose the peasantry, those are the poor majority of people, and workers submitted to the power of the monarchs? There's more peasants than monarchs. Why didn't they simply rise up and overthrow the king or the queen? And then identify one reason why torture was used during the Middle Ages. So these answers should go in your notes. Hopefully this was helpful. Hopefully it clarifies some things that maybe you were confuzzled about in class. We will see you in Air 309, ding dong, mother scratches.